Welcome to the Content Strategy Interviews podcast. Each week, we talk with accomplished content strategy experts to share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 10th episode of the Content Strategy Interviews podcast. I'm really happy today to have with us Peter Herford. Peter is a really accomplished longtime journalist and journalism educator. He started his career in 1962, around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the James Meredith entering the University of Mississippi, the whole civil rights movement was in full swing. John Glenn orbited the Earth for the first time. Then he wrapped up his career in 1989 during the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Tiananmen Square protests were happening, and that's also the year that Tim Berners-Lee invented the internet, and I'm hoping that can somehow slide into this. So, Peter, let me ask you
to tell... And it didn't end there.
No.
Oh, I kept right on going.
No, exactly.
I just left CBS.
Mm-hmm. And you've been pretty much a journalism educator since then, right?
Mostly, yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and tell me about that. You were at Columbia for a while, and you
taught at Columbia for 6 years, then ran a fellowship program at the University of Chicago, where journalism is not a subject of study, but it was great for journalists to be able to swim around in the pool of a great university. Yeah. Then from there, where did I go? Oh, I know. From there, I went to Croatia for 3 years to use some of your tax money as helping independent journalists during the last years of the Tudjman regime in Croatia, he being more or less, or more, a dictator. Then from there I went to Portugal for 3 years to put the first all-news cable channel on the air for Portugal Telecom, which controlled the cable system. From there I went to Public Radio International in Minneapolis, where we produced The World, the only program of foreign news in the United States. Unbelievable, but it still is, was then, is now. And then from there I went to China for 10 years. And I came back in 2013, and if they hadn't played their retirement rules, which are draconian, I'd still be there.
You'd still be there.
Best 10 years of my life.
Right. So you founded a program there with Peter Arnett, right?
Not with Peter. I hired Peter later to come on board. I started a journalism program with a woman by the name of Ying Chan, who started the journalism program at Hong Kong University. And when the people running this particular university in China found out about that, they said, "How about doing it for us?" So I happened to meet her through mutual friends. We shook hands, and I found myself in China.
Right, and then until there was a new administration in China.
Not the new administration. It was the rules that had always existed. The Chinese forced Chinese to retire males at 60, women at 55. They give foreigners a break up to age 70. I was older than that when I started, but I was off the map in terms of the big cities of China. I was in a small Chinese city of 4.5 million.
Just a tiny one.
Yeah.
But they eventually caught up with you, and to our benefit here in Seattle.
That was the change in regime, because they decided they were going to bring everything under very strict party control. They didn't want foreigners teaching in China. Unless it was teaching English or some non-controversial subject. But the idea of teaching journalism on international principles, forget it. Out, right. Please. Yeah. They were very nice about it, but that was it.
Don't let the door hit you on the way.
Right.
Okay, yeah. Wait, Peter, so the reason I wanted to have you on the show today is that we had lunch, I don't know, a couple months ago, and I mentioned the term content strategy.
Yes.
And you didn't exactly roll your eyes, but I saw an eyebrow go up. And so I just wanted to, so the way I understand content strategy is that it's sort of a discipline that's emerged as the digitization of media has happened, and people have needed to manage things differently. But it occurs to me that content, being strategic about content, is probably an old established tradition. Probably goes back to storytellers around campfires. But tell me what that eyebrow lift was about.
It's jargon. It's describing something that has always existed, which is now had to adapt to a digital world. Nothing more than that. Now, it's very nice to give things those clever titles, because that permits people to suddenly proclaim their expertise, write books, go on talking tours, make a hell of a lot of money, usually people who have never participated in the process. And that's what I object to. I mean, if you want to have a discussion about what you call content strategy.
Yeah.
See how fast I can forget it?
Yeah.
That's fine. There is something to that, but it's nothing new.
Right.
It has always existed.
No, it's always, and there's a bunch of definitions that are floating around, but probably kind of the broadest commonly accepted definition would be it's sort of planning for the creation and development and distribution of content.
What do you think people did before digital?
Exactly.
If you manage a media organization, it was no different in my days at CBS News or in the entertainment division or at NBC or ABC. They were managing their content just as much.
Right.
With the same principles.
You were both a producer and then an executive at CBS. So you were managing a ton of, and this goes back, well, I guess, so when did you guys start to digitize stuff? I know there was a transition from film to tape to,
and it was in that process. I mean, the first thing that happened were transistors. And of course, those are giant, those are vacuum tubes compared to today, what you could put on a chip, or a chip you can't even see. So it was a process that evolved over time. And talk about management issues, that was all happening while one was broadcasting. So one had to figure out how to integrate all of this new stuff into a system that had been in operation since television began. So, what's changed? Nothing.
No, that concept, and something we've talked about a lot. You talk about one of the key characteristics of this era is relentless and ever increasingly paced change.
Right.
And
exactly.
so you've seen
that's more important.
Yeah.
That's far more important. Because managing change, also, nothing new. We've always had to do it. We now have to do it at a pace that has never existed before, a lot of which has to do, and this is where AI comes in, why AI has become so important, to try and get ahead of that kind of a game. That's the real challenge. If you have something and it evolves over time, as we did from the days of vacuum tubes into transistors into the digital world, that happens slowly enough, you can manage that. Because it's hard to fall behind unless you're a lousy manager. But once you got into the digital world, the analogy I always use is that in news, when we were carrying around cameras that weighed 80 pounds on film, had to develop that film, then transmit it across the country to get it into the system, on and on and on. That was the reality we were living with. Well, we knew better. We knew technology could make the equipment we used lighter, more efficient, all that kind of thing. So we were constantly pushing on the engineers saying, help, help, get us out of this mess we're on. It's very hard to fight a war and film it when you've got a huge camera on your shoulder and you are a target by yourself. Well, anyway, when the digital world came and cameras got reduced to the size they are now, the world flipped because all of a sudden the technology had raced ahead. And it's sitting there with crossed arms looking at us now saying, well, here I am. What do you want to do with this? So we have capabilities today we haven't even started to touch. That's a challenge. That's much more a challenge than what some of these other people are describing.
Right. I sometimes feel like I've been doing this digital media stuff for 22 years now. And I feel like we're just now starting to realize some of the promise that was set out in the early days when the first browsers and things came out.
That's because we don't talk to the technical people, and the content people don't do enough talking back and forth. Many of the technical people do not have the skills to speak English. That's something they need to learn. They need to be, the best of them are terrific. They can explain anything to you, even if you are a baby in the digital world. But in order to take advantage of what you're talking about, you have to understand what it is capable of doing, what it is doing, and where the areas of potential growth are. And then it's imagination, then it's innovation, then you can really do something.
Mm-hmm. So maybe it just takes a while for people to pull that together. Because I feel like I've tried to do that, tried to understand enough of the technology, enough of the new business practices, enough of the new creative.
Well, you may have to look in other areas, because we're not all necessarily creative in a given field. What are you good at? And you figure out what you're good at, and then how do you apply the tools to produce what you want to produce, whether it's writing a book or whether it is producing television or something we haven't even thought of. Andy Rooney, before he was gone, was still typing on his beloved typewriter.
And you could still do that and just scan it in. There'd be some
and you
cool
can be as
software
good as Andy Rooney was,
Exactly.
right? So a lot of it has to do is, what are you good at? And do you need the technology to be good at it? He didn't. Can you use the technology to improve your skills, your talents, so forth and so on? All of that goes with it.
One thing that I think that's emerged in modern management culture is a lot more, and I don't know if it is a lot more, but there's a real emphasis on collaboration in business now, because of the ever-increasing pace, the breadth and depth of knowledge you have to do anything with content nowadays. How does that... how collaborative were you? Had to collaborate. I mean, to put on the CBS Evening News, you have to collaborate with a lot of people.
It's a team sport.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, it's the answer you're after. What do you mean by collaboration? Working with somebody else? How many jobs can you do all by yourself? Very few. Very, very few.
Yeah.
So if you take the broadest sense of what collaboration is, it applies to virtually everybody. So I don't see where that has particularly changed.
Well, one example of that, I just a couple of interviews ago, I talked to a guy named Rand Fishkin here in Seattle. He's a search engine optimization and content marketing expert. He talked about, I asked him what his ideal team would be to execute like an SEO campaign. And he talked about a cross-disciplinary team that would include technologists, content creators, creative people, and all that. And that's a pretty, an emerging and common thing. When you think back on your experience, like as a manager and executive, how can you picture how that could improve things, or the challenges?
It's no different. There's a simple word for that. It's always been around. It's called casting. You want to make a film? What's the film about? Who are the best actors and actresses you can get to fulfill the vision that you have for your film? It's called casting. How is it any different than management? You have a task to accomplish. You have whatever inputs there are to that task, and then you look around at the people around you, the ones you know, the ones you have contact with. Who are the best people within your company, outside your company, whatever? That's no different. Nothing has changed.
And I'm running off with that analogy. The producer, the director, the casting director, the
always
props,
been there.
all that. Yeah, it's always
been there.
Yeah.
I mean, the danger in all this is to think the word "new" is the trap that you can fall into very quickly. The advertising business has been very good about convincing us that the things that they offer us are new. 99% of them are not new. Or whatever changes they have made are so incremental they don't change the basic product at all. There was a wonderful example the other day of a friend of mine who's a superb cook. She was mentioning the fact that for certain things that she does, she uses Crisco. And Crisco is an ancient product going way back in time. And I'd forgotten about it. I'm not that good a cook. I'd forgotten about it. The next time I went to the supermarket, I said, let's see if it's here. Sure enough, it's there. But interestingly enough, it's on the lowest shelf possible, which is where the stuff moves the least and is the cheapest. So, what's new?
Right.
And you have to be careful there.
No, the thing that is new, I think, like new media, that's a term that's used to try to encompass all of the changes of the last 20, 30 years, the growth of, I think this combination of technology you talked about, you've seen the transition from tubes to transistors to circuit boards. And there's also been the rise of just the ability to communicate more quickly and efficiently to the point where we have instant access with anybody on the planet.
Yeah, but now you're making my point.
Mm-hmm.
What does new media mean to you?
Yeah. Well, to me, I think, there's this, I think about that a lot. Like, just as, a lot of people point out, like, radio didn't replace newspapers, TV didn't replace radio, but the web seems like this thing that can, like, encompass and grab all of that, and it's...
which means what?
Which that's what I don't...
It means it's a distribution system.
Mm-hmm.
That's all it is.
Yeah.
The web has no inherent creativity. The web is simply a large soup bowl into which all of these other things have come, most of which have been around from the point at which technology made it possible.
Mm-hmm.
In 1910, no television hadn't been invented yet.
Right.
By the 1930s, there were the beginnings of television. From there on, anybody with vision knew this was a path worth following. And indeed, here we are. Television has been added to the mix. An analogy to this is audio, sound. Mm-hmm. When technologies were developed to get us beyond the little old-fashioned radio box with a single speaker and a tuner dial, so forth and so on, what happened? Audio equipment got layered in the home. New things came along, so you bought the newest thing. You didn't throw out the old one, you bought the newest thing. And it was not unusual to go into somebody's home and they had sort of generations of the growth of audio in terms of binaural sound, which preceded stereo, right? Microphone that was placed like 2 ears to record things, that was binaural sound, precursor to stereo. So if you had the money, you bought that equipment and your sound system was better. Then along came stereo sound. You bought the stereo system and the speakers got better, and yada, yada, yada. This is what happens to all of these things. So we simply layer developments and improve them. Nowadays, of course, because the stuff is so relatively inexpensive, we throw out the old. That's one thing that has changed, and we make electronic garbage out of it.
That's right, and that technology. That's the inverse of the growth is the cost keeps going down.
That's right. Well, it's the old Moore's law, which is still effective.
Yep.
Not quite as effective as it was, but it's there.
Yeah, the technology front. So like Moore's law, and I guess technology management. That's kind of what I wanted to come back around to. Is one of the disciplines that sort of overlays with content strategy is information architecture. This notion that you need to have things kind of organized underneath there. And there's things like taxonomies and navigation schemes and ways of hierarchical organizations of information.
The problem with all that?
Okay, yeah.
You're using language that most people don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And it's there for only one reason. It's to exclude people.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole point of good management is to include people, not exclude them. So that if you use all these catchphrases,
mm-hmm.
you're boxing yourself into a corner where it's very hard to get anything done because nobody can understand what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can explain it simply to them in simple English, they can be very helpful because they're the ones who are going to have to do the work. Mm-hmm. But all of these catchphrases, to me, are nonsense. Absolute nonsense, because they don't describe anything new. They describe the normal challenges of management.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go to management schools, it doesn't matter whether they are good, bad, or indifferent. They are both the worst and the best at this. The worst of them are they develop their own jargon, so that if you've gone to Wharton, you speak Wharton. If you've gone to Harvard, you speak Harvard. If you go to UW, you speak UW. These kinds of things. But the best of them take these basic principles and treat them as what they are, basic principles of good management, which work anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
They need to be adapted to some of the challenges, such as you've described, in the digital world as it progresses. But the fundamental principles, when I was at the University of Chicago, Leon Lederman was in the physics department. Nobel Prize winning physicist. He ran the Argonne National Laboratory in Illinois. He gave a freshman course in physics. And the freshman course in physics that he gave was the most popular course at the University of Chicago for all students who are not going into physics, because he had the capacity of taking the fundamental principles of physics, which included nuclear physics, and being able to teach them to a child. And students would line up literally 3 to 4 days in advance, camp out on the campus to register for that course. These are the kinds of people we need.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's something that comes up. Like I said, this is my 10th episode of this. Almost everybody else I've talked to have talked about the importance of like not just good content, but great content. That you need to be that kind of storyteller and presenter, that you have people lining up 2 or 3, the analogous thing to lining up 2 or 3 days before registration opens. You probably learned a thing or two about storytelling in your time at CBS.
Sure.
That seems like, I think at the foundation of all this well, actually, let me back up a little bit from that.
Sure.
The word content, it still drives me nuts a little bit, but I haven't found a better umbrella term because it encompasses text and audio and video.
Yeah, but why?
Mm-hmm.
Why should it?
Mm-hmm.
Why do you need one term to cover everything?
Mm-hmm.
When the terms that we have for specific parts of the creative area, if you will, fine, use them, target them, speak about them. Because if you try to look for, when we started this discussion in terms of content, good storytelling, great storytelling, there are very few people who do this well. The percentages haven't changed. There are many, many movies made each year. The percentage of really good movies is very small and has changed very little over time. Because what you have people who are workmanlike at what they do. Mm-hmm. You have those who are skilled and talented. That's a slightly larger pool. And then you have a slightly smaller pool, I should say. Then you have those people who are really terrific at what they do. And the pool gets smaller and smaller as the pyramid gets narrower and narrower, and you end up at the top with a few dozen people at the most who are really great at their craft. It's no different in the performing arts. How many really great musicians are there?
Right.
There are a lot of skilled people. There are particularly now with the Chinese coming into the world on all levels, and this includes technology. There are so many that a small percentage of Chinese is a huge number of people.
Right.
So that if
the ratios hold, they're just going to win.
Precisely.
Numbers, yeah.
So if you go to the University of Washington and you look across that campus, you say, am I in China? There's so many Asians there. Well, come on, it figures. Yeah. So these are all the kinds of things that are having an effect. But the fundamentals of great skill, great talent, they haven't changed.
Mm-hmm. Hey, one thing that I think has changed is that one of the top level challenges for people, like when you were at CBS, there were still basically 3 networks most of the time, and you pretty much had people's attention. Now attention is the scarcest resource. Capturing people's attention. So even if you are one of those top of the pyramid content creators, it can still be hard to grab people. Yeah. How do you content on its own probably doesn't just stand out, like a good play or a good movie. There's this need to grab people's attention about it. And that's another story. That's like the promotional story on top of the...
Well, that has to do with promotion, it has to do with marketing, it has to do with advertising. It also has to do with expectations. Mm-hmm. I mean, the essential thing that has changed is, and you can see this reflected in the size of audiences, and everybody is suffering as a result. You used to be able to accumulate huge audiences. The only thing that will accumulate a huge audience these days is the Super Bowl. And the Olympics, even the Winter Olympics. I wouldn't be surprised if they don't get much attention. They're about to come up. How much have you seen advertising the Winter Olympics? Yeah, very little. Exactly. Not great interest in it. Anyway, it's a narrow set of sports. And even the Summer Olympics. And now the distribution systems have changed entirely. So access to these things is now far greater than it ever was, which means if you are the content provider, you're not going to be able to come up with the kind of models that will sustain an advertising model, for instance. And a lot of people are facing this.
Right.
At CBS, we used to produce documentaries. They were cheap by comparison to entertainment. They were very expensive as news product because they took months to produce and large teams of people, all this kind of thing. And as the network's influence waned, cable came along. Cable had no interest and no money to produce traditional news documentaries. And there were many, many stories written about the death of the documentary. And it looked that way to anybody who looked at it. But if you looked at it very hard, you had a generation of kids coming along, carrying cameras the size of your thumbnail, and they started making documentaries for 1/100th the cost that a network would. And sure, a lot of them were junk. A lot of them were terrible. A few of them were pretty good because those few talented people came along. Guess what? We are now in the golden age of documentaries. On any given day, you could not live long enough to see all of the documentaries that are now being produced all over the world. So these are the kinds of shifts that take place, which many of them are triggered by technological developments. Mm-hmm. But the essential content hasn't changed. It's still called a documentary. A good documentary is a good documentary. What we have learned is that instead of spending $800,000 to produce an hour, it can be done with as little as $15,000 or even $10,000
right.
by an individual.
You've talked a lot in your journalism education about follow the money, like when you're developing a news story. But this is almost any story, and that gets me thinking about the following the money in this case. Part of it is that it's really been democratized. That the cost of production is so low that anybody can do it. But there's still big players, and they're figuring out a way to aggregate the content and like Facebook would be and Google would be the classic examples of content aggregators.
Yeah, but also the New York Times and the Washington Post, because these were and still are the major news gathering organizations with their print history, and they have 20/20 vision. They look ahead. They say, "Guess what, folks? This isn't going to work in the future. We have to change," and they are going about change very successfully. It's taken time. Their revenue is not what it was with advertising, but it's coming in balance. They remain profitable, by the way. Both organizations and other similar news organizations have had the same trajectory going through these things. You adapt. You adapt or you die. It's that simple.
And that includes financially as well as technologically.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
But it's also driven by expectations. You know, one of the terrible things in the United States, in the U.S. system, are the expectations of the investors, because because of the system of reporting that we have every quarter and having to produce a better quarter each quarter over the last one, that ties your hands in many, many ways. This is where an organization like Amazon, and I think it's the brilliance of their management, Chief Mr. Bezos, who for a long time produced no profit whatsoever. The wise people stuck with his stock. And the dumb ones said, get rid of it. It's terrible. It'll never produce a profit. Look at what's happening. Well, he invested every dime he could and then some into what has grown to be what we know today as Amazon. It is profitable. Its stock has risen to heights that nobody ever thought it would, and it will go further, all these kinds of things. So it's how you approach the problem that you have.
Yeah, how did you approach the technological changes during your tenure? Because you were at an executive level towards the end of your tenure, and technology was starting to come along. Like, I was in publishing back in that era, and there was digital typesetting and things like that. There must have been analogous things happening in broadcast.
Yeah, but again, as I said before, one of the things that happened was you had no choice. The technology came along, and you had to adapt to it. And you had to adapt to it while you were on the air. So that story in sports that is well known is one day an engineer, a story came out of Japan about a Korean engineer who had developed what didn't exist in those days, which was the ability to make slow motion television out of a recording. And CBS got a hold of this rumor, sent some technicians, tracked the guy down. He was one of these individual inventors. And what they found was a room the size of this living room, 20, 30 by 20, something like that, full of technology, full of humming pieces of equipment. And this was the first slow motion television. He demonstrated it, it worked, and needless to say, CBS said, we'll buy it.
I'll take it.
Right? And what did they ask for? They said, well, show us the schematic drawings. He didn't have any. They literally had to take that piece of equipment apart, one piece at a time, to rebuild it. That was the beginning. Well, now the camera that you have in your hands, that is barely the size of your palm, will produce any kind of television you want, including high definition, slow motion, still pictures, you name it, all this kind of thing. That's a trajectory that isn't that old. Mm-hmm. So it's not a matter of how you adapt to that. The how you adapt is in the future, is where you make decisions today. And this is where an Amazon is probably a good example. Walmart faces the same issue, Target, all these people face the same issue. They know where they are. They know what other people are doing. They have to figure out, how do we remain competitive in this field? Because follow the money, this is very, very expensive stuff. Yes, it's cheap to buy a little camera. It's hugely expensive to do the R&D and to develop the equipment that is going to detail what your future is all about. So those are the gambles. Those are the risk takers. That's what it's about.
And that gets to the term strategy, what you're just talking about there.
Yeah,
it's like,
sure.
Here's this landscape, here's this terrain, here's what we've got, here's what we want to do.
Yeah.
How are we going to craft a strategy to make that happen? How consciously did you craft your strategy at CBS because in some ways news is sort of responsive, reactive. All. Yeah, exactly.
Forget it.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. That was my assumption. I just wanted to validate that.
At the end, when the crew came back from Apollo 11, the first moonshot, they did a tour of the United States. And I was the producer on that tour. And I went to my boss and I said, look, we know where they're going and all this kind of stuff, but how much do we want to cover, and what kind of a budget do I have for this? He looked at me and he said, Peter, spend what you have to. Those were the glory days of television news, because there was only CBS, NBC, and ABC. There were none of the cable operators and all this kind of thing to worry about, and satellites and so forth. So we did what we had to do, and we had, God bless it, an organization that said, when it comes to news, do not try to do traditional budgeting, because it's going to get knocked out of the box by developments, by things that are going to happen.
Well, that's it. So there seems like there might be lessons in there for this modern environment where things are just changing so quickly and unpredictably that I'm just fishing there.
No.
That they're
reasonable to fish, but the principle is very simple. Mm-hmm. Be very good at what you do, and be flexible. Obviously, do not look for the kinds of things that box you in. Mm-hmm. Do not create models that you are afraid of changing because it's not going to work.
Right.
I think be very adaptive. And any creative field has this.
Yeah, there's a number of models nowadays that have emerged that are kind of distributed differently around, but like the agile methodologies or lean methodologies or design thinking and things like that. They're just sort of new ways.
Jargon.
I was going to say, as I'm looking at you, I'm actually working on one of those like the crazy person in the movie with all the diagrams on the wall.
Yeah,
I'm kind of doing a little concordance chart now of like all of those methodologies. And like you just said, I think, and this is true in like some other fields I'm familiar with, that like in continuing education in a lot of professional fields, there will be like, there's maybe 10 core principles that are at the top of this thing, but there's 100 brand names for it as people develop programs around it. And I think that buzzwords...
Who says there are 10 core principles?
Yeah, I'm just making that up.
Yeah, but even if you weren't.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, to anybody who says that, I would say, what are they?
Mm-hmm.
And I bet the two of us can sit here and tear it to shreds and invent 10 more, 50 more, 100 more, this kind of thing. No, I don't think the fundamentals of good management have changed one iota. And I don't think they will. First of all, it's dealing with people more than anything else. Why do great companies succeed and other companies fail? 9 times out of 10, it's because of the people, not because of the model.
Yeah. How did you cultivate and develop your people skills? Did that
same way everybody else does? You keep your ear to the ground. Who's good out there? Who isn't? You listen to, look, watch other product, and if you see something that stands out, it's a very simple question: who did that? Mm-hmm. And then if you don't know them, you find out about them, and are they available? And you grab them when you can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, was the competition fierce back then for talent?
Sure, it is today.
Yeah. It is today. When you look at in the technical fields in particular, it's
all
just
fields.
Crazy.
It's not. Again, we're not dealing with principles that have changed, because the pool of people you want is always smaller than the demand. Always going to be there. Again, I keep using Amazon as an example because I think their success speaks to the fact that some of the principles that they are using seem to work very, very well. One of them is when Amazon really came up above the trench level in terms of visibility, there were a lot of news articles about what a terrible place it is to work. Well, looked at from one point of view, that's quite right. The pressure is enormous, is absolutely huge. But why? That's the question that wasn't being asked. It is because of the boss who said, anybody who works here has one basic principle as far as I'm concerned. I want them to work their way out of their job to the next higher level, which also means if you don't, old military principle, you don't get promoted, you're out, right? And you go do something else, which you should figure out for yourself. I don't care what job you're in. If you find yourself generally doing well, you have choices. You can probably keep that up and have a long career and have a nice retirement and everything goes fine. If you feel you have real skills and talent and something beyond the average, you become competitive and you give yourself a goal. I will do this for the next 2, 3, 5 years, and if I've reached this level, fine, I'll keep going as far as I can go. If I haven't, I got to rethink this. Maybe I'm not as good as I think I am.
Mm-hmm.
Old principles. These things haven't changed. They're the same.
Yeah.
Put a label on them and they haven't changed.
Right. Well, that's kind of heartening to think that in the midst of all this, we can fall back on these old principles that and I think that's, I don't know, it seems like there's a growing recognition in, especially technology management, of people are important and that you need to include a variety of perspectives and different kinds of people.
Anybody who didn't believe that in the first place shouldn't be in the business.
Yeah. But I think, and something you mentioned earlier, I do see there is a growing ability of people in the tech world to engage better and to explain better and to collaborate better with people who are less technical. I think it's almost a prerequisite to be a good technical person now, is to be able to at least communicate with your boss and your colleagues.
You used an interesting word. Mm-hmm. You said now.
No.
Why has it been any different? Why is that any different?
Well, I guess
it's
maybe
not new.
No, okay. I guess let me back up, because I think what I'm thinking about, there's especially in the IT in the tech world.
Yeah.
There's the old stereotype of the grumpy guy sitting behind his computer, not giving you what you want. And now I think it's flipped so that in areas like, for example, digital marketing, that the marketing guys are kind of maybe not making the decisions, but collaborating with and or even supervising the technologists whereas 20 years ago it was the opposite. The technologists were driving, like if you needed to do something to your website,
right.
you went
right.
to the tech guy. Now you would go to the marketing person or the content strategist, content manager, somebody like that.
I guess there the simple principle is things have become more accessible.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense, because I think that's one of the, again, back to the democratization angle, that
exactly.
things that used to be up in ivory towers are now accessible to us all.
And why were they in ivory towers? We're right back to the jargon.
Yeah,
well, keep everybody out of here. I made mine. I don't want any competition.
Yeah.
So I isolate myself, and I make other people think it's impossible to come up into the tower.
Right. Oz everywhere.
Yeah.
And and there's probably some follow the money stuff in there too.
Well, sure, but again, it's a fundamental human principle.
Mm-hmm.
You know, none of us like competition. Well, I should back off. Some people do like competition, but most people don't. Most people, when they have achieved something, the worst information is that you've now got 10 other people biting at you, wanting to do what you're doing and maybe better at it than you are,
right,
because you're not getting any younger. All those kinds of things.
Yeah, I want to go memory lane a little bit on that, because what you're just talking about, like in the 60s when you started, CBS News was kind of the top dog in the news world, right? That's how
top dog in a very small kennel.
Mm-hmm.
Less than 50% of the U.S. population had TV sets when I got started. You know, it wasn't a serious business.
Wasn't hard
It really wasn't a serious business. What changed the news business?
Mm-hmm.
Very simple. The John F. Kennedy assassination. That changed things. And there's a good example of something that you also have to be prepared for. Mm-hmm. And we weren't. We absolutely were not. Here was an event. Nobody could predict it. Nobody had trained for this. Nobody had developed tools to apply to this. We had the tools we had. There was a moment in the chain of events leading up to the confirmation of his death, which was, we were all, ABC, CBS, NBC, we were all on the air with regular programs, and we broke into them for bulletins as little pieces of information developed. The death was confirmed, and not long after that, I forget whether it was minutes or an hour or two, I remember a phone call coming from Dr. Frank Stanton, who was the president of CBS News, to Don Hewitt, who was then the executive producer of the CBS Evening News, and we were the core of this information flow. And Don, who was the inventor of 60 Minutes and an absolute genius in his own mind, and could speak faster than anybody in the world, and did, was being incredibly silent, other than saying yes, no to his boss, calling from the headquarters in New York. And I was sitting right beside him. When he finally hung up, I looked at him and said, "What did he say? What did he say?" And he said, "We can take air anytime we want to and keep it." This had never before been done in television, anywhere in the world. And once we did, we suddenly faced something that is perfectly normal today. We were on the air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But we were a funny little organization with not that many people and no tools to do this. And an infrastructure in television that was totally incapable of meeting what we instinctively knew we should do and could do. So we spent the next 4.5 days on the air filling time in ways that were purely inventive. Mm-hmm. And we changed television. We changed television all over the world. It wasn't just CBS. NBC did the same thing. ABC did the same thing. So suddenly the world stopped. It really did. The United States particularly. People went to their TV sets and they stared into that tube for the next 4 days.
And that's interesting, because that's like something that isn't only possible with mass media, but is certainly amplified by having just a few channels and the attention of everybody.
Yeah.
There are, I think now, like, and I don't know, a modern day analogy to that kind of situation might be something like the Russian influence and just the general tampering in the election via Facebook and other social media platforms.
No, it's no analogy, because the difference was, one, this was an event there have been assassinations before,
Mm-hmm.
but the confluence of there was a distribution system available to move information of this level of high interest, which pulled a country together, and indeed countries around the world participated in this through radio, so that all of a sudden the world was privy to an event in a way that had never been privy to an event before. There is no analogy for that today. We've become accustomed to it. We fully expect it. Anything major that happens, you find out about something because a friend calls you, "Did you hear that?" And whatever, it fills out that sentence. What's the first thing you're going to do? What do you do today?
I go to Twitter.
You go to Twitter.
I go to Twitter for the real time. Like if there's something breaking.
See, Larry, you're an old man. Not as old as I am, but you're an old man. If you were 20 years younger, what would you do?
I don't know. I don't know. It's hard to get myself out of my head to go. You go to the interwebs, but which exactly?
Well, you'd reach in your pocket for your smartphone.
Oh, your smartphone. Yeah. Okay. The gadget.
Which gives you access to everything.
Mm-hmm.
And the most sophisticated smartphones now have more computing power than the United States had when they sent those men to the moon. Fact.
Yeah.
Simple fact. So that we now have ability given to us by the digital world, which, by the way, is still embryonic.
Right.
Because if you add certain things we know about, but are only beginning to develop, keyed by artificial intelligence, which is the real driving force for the next 10 or more years at least, then we will look back on today, those people who are still around, we will look back on today and we'll laugh. We'll say, "Oh, come on, that was silly."
Okay. Yeah.
That was like driving a Model T Ford at the Formula One races.
Well, I guess I want to go back a little bit to that because I'm just thinking about the evolution of media and how different events kind of shaped refocus what came before and focus what came after. And so there's the Kennedy assassination. I think of Watergate. That was a huge one. You jump ahead to 9/11.
Those are just news stories. No.
Those were not. They weren't changing in the way.
No, because the change in the Kennedy assassination was we hadn't had, thank heavens, an assassination in a long time. And the previous one was in an era where your best communication was opening the window and shouting, right? Compared to where we were then. We adapted the available tools, which turned out to be something we had never thought about doing, pulling the world together on a single event, because we couldn't imagine what that would be. Super Bowl, yeah, it's terrific. You get all of the football fans, and there are an incredible number of them. But it's a finite group. The Kennedy assassination was not a finite group. It was the world, which other places where the impact of the Kennedy assassination might have been nil, found out about this and instinctively became interested in the story because Kennedy had an image worldwide. He had an image of hope, he had an image of change, he had an image that had captured people's imaginations all over the world, suddenly snuffed out like this. The impact of that has no analogy, has absolutely no analogy. That happens once. What happens afterwards is you learn from that. You do things. Your reporting becomes better. You have better capabilities. You develop better tools. All these kinds of things happen. But the impact of what you're doing goes down. That curve goes down. So that now stories that used to last days, weeks, years are over within hours sometimes. Donald Trump has learned this lesson way back when he was on television doing entertainment. Keep your face and your voice in people's eyes and ears constantly. No president in history of any country in the world has ever gotten the kind of coverage that he has. he has learned better than anybody else. We haven't learned much. Mm-hmm. We follow him around like little puppy dogs.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that kind of gets back to the scarcest commodity now is attention, and he's figured out how to grab it, and
it's not grab it.
Mm-hmm.
Keep it.
And keep it.
Anybody can grab it. You know, you can do anything you want, and people will look at the number. Remember, very few years ago, the term "it went viral" was relatively new and not used that much. It took a hell of a lot for something to go viral, right? Now things go viral every hour, sometimes every minute, so that the tools we now have give us the ability to jump on something, give it 2, 3, 5, 10 million hits in ways that we never could before because we didn't think of it. Mm-hmm. But now we reach into our pocket. Most of us are tied to the world instantly. You know, all of these things are capabilities we simply didn't have before, but they also reduce the impact.
Right, it's like there's the same amount of attention, it's just flattened out across.
Well, actually diminished. It's not flat, it's diminished.
Actually, yeah.
That's where keeping the attention. That's why I use the Trump example. Mm-hmm. He pounds away at it.
Derek Thompson just wrote a book about that, spacing on the name of the Atlantic Monthly Reporter, about the sort of the principles that underlie things that become viral. Not like there's so many of these blog posts about how to make your video go viral. This was actually analyzing the underlying. Anyhow, that might be an instructive thing for all of us to look at, is how those. Yeah. Well, how would you, if you were setting out today to start a new media company, how would you get and keep people's attention? How would you?
Depends what I was. You need to describe the business better that I'm in. A media company?
Right.
What is that? What's a media company?
Yeah.
What businesses am I in?
Let's say you're a journalist and you're covering like Seattle.
Right.
And you need to make money.
Right. Mm-hmm. You know what I want to be?
Mm-hmm.
The best writer in the world. Nothing has changed. The hardest thing in the world to find is a good writer. This is true of book writing, of magazine writing, of journalism in all of its forms. It's still the hardest person to find. Is not just the good writer, the great writer.
The great writer.
Right. So that's where you begin. Nothing has changed.
Nice. Well, let's wrap it up there. I love that. That's a great place to bring it back to the content. Thanks so much, Peter.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another content strategy interview.